So here we are given that we have a parallelogram QRST, and so I actually graphed those points right here. You can see I have QRST. We graph these points and we get a parallelogram, and we want to figure out if it's a rhombus, a rectangle, or a square. And keeping in mind it could be all both. Remember, a rhombus is just a parallelogram, with all sides being congruent. So that's the key. All sides have to be congruent. Now we know it's a parallelogram, so opposite sides are already congruent. So we already know that ST is congruent to RQ. So there's no point in finding all four sides. But if we find two sides that are not opposite, like ST and TQ, and show that they are congruent, we can then conclude that all four sides are congruent. Again, since parallel sides are congruent, if two sides that are not, opposite sides are congruent, if two sides that are not opposite are congruent, that means that all four are going to be congruent. So we need to find the distance formula. So we're going to find the distance of TS and TQ. So distance formula, don't forget that distance formula for general is going to be x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. It doesn't matter which order you add these in or subtract these in. You're just finding a difference in the x values and a difference in the y values, squaring them and adding them. So if we're looking for TS, here we're going to have difference in the x's. So we get -1 minus -1, which is actually going to be -1 plus 1, which is 0 squared, plus 5 minus 1, which is 4 squared. That's going to give us the square root of 4 squared, which is 16. So the distance there is 4. So that means that side is 4. So if we have TQ, which again is not an opposite side to TS. So if TS is 4, we know that QR is going to be 4. With TQ, the distance there is going to be, again, changing the x's, which is a 3 minus a -1, so that's a 4 squared, plus a 5 minus 5, which is 0 squared. That's going to be the square root of 16, which again is 4. So because these non-opposite sides are congruent, all four sides are congruent, and it's a rhombus. Now we want to check out if it's a square, and we're going to do that by first finding out if it's a rectangle. So a rectangle means that it's going to have 4 right angles. Now we already know this is a parallelogram, so don't forget, if we have one right angle, we're going to have 4 right angles. That's the theorem for parallelograms. If one angle is 90 degrees, they all must be 90 degrees. So we want to find out the slope for TS, the slope for TQ, and if they're opposite reciprocals, it means that they are perpendicular, giving us a right angle, making this a rectangle. So TS, M is going to be the change in Y over the change in X. So for TS, it's going to be 5 minus 1 over -1. -1 minus a -1. So that's going to give us 4 over 0, which we know is undefined. We're going to leave it as 4 over 0 just to see if we get something else. So this is what we call an undefined slope. And so that means that if TQ has a slope that is 0, those will be opposite reciprocals. They will meet at 90 degrees. So TQ, that's going to be 5 minus 5 over -1 minus 3. So this gives me a 0 over -4. And here you can see the denominator is now in the numerator. The numerator is now in the denominator, and it's opposite. It used to be positive, now it's negative. Of course, this is still 0, but because these are opposite reciprocal slopes, they are perpendicular, giving us our 90-degree angle for it to be a rectangle. If it's both a rhombus and a rectangle, it is automatically a square. It cannot be a square and not a rhombus. It cannot be a square and not a rectangle. So if I found out that this was not a rhombus, it could still be a rectangle, but it could never be a square. If I found out that this wasn't a rhombus, if I found out that this was a rhombus, maybe it wouldn't be a rectangle, in which case it would not be a square. So when you have these, you're going to have rhombus or rhombi. You're going to have rectangles, and in the middle, that's going to be squares. So a shape that is both a rectangle and a rhombus is going to be a square. But you can have rhombi that are not rectangles, and you can have rectangles that are not rhombi.